Hello, everyone. People will begin to zoom in, but I want to get us started. I'm Lauren Kuby, Manager of Events for the Global Institute of Sustainability Innovation. And it's my honor to introduce our moderator, ASU's Dave White. Dave White is the Deputy Director of GOC, as we call it, the Global Institute of Sustainability Innovation. Dave, thanks so much for moderating today.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today. Shanna Farrell is the author of several books, most recently, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. She has also written several other titles, including Bay Area Cocktails, A History of Culture, Community, and Craft. And her recent book, A Good Drink, is the focus of our discussion today. As an interviewer at UC Berkeley's Oral History Center, Shanna works on a wide variety of projects and specializes in contemporary cocktail culture. Welcome, Shanna, and we look forward to your discussion today.
Thanks for having me. All right, I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I'm here today to talk about my new book, A Good Drink in Pursuit of Sustainable Spirits. As Dave mentioned, I work at UC Berkeley's Oral History Center. I'm an interviewer on staff, and I specialize in cocktail culture, but also environmental history, which is where my academic background lies. And so I'm just gonna give you a brief overview of kind of what the book is like. So essentially, I'm looking at spirits as agricultural products. They are, in fact, made with the same crops that we eat at our dinner tables, but we don't often treat them like that. So the book really looks at what's at stake when we don't treat them like that. It looks at different environmental issues that come up for different categories and of spirits, and the people who are doing things well and creating models that we can look at. I really see that the environmental component of this is a spectrum. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so by highlighting different people, I think that they're moving the industry forward, thinking about the environment. And what I'm going to do is kind of go through a few of the people in the book just to give you a bit of a flavor of what is in store. So the book starts with whiskey, and I am really thinking about distillers in Charleston, South Carolina, called Highwire Distilling. It's owned by a husband and wife team, Ann Marshall and Scott Blackwell. And what they do is they create direct relationships with farmers that they're sourcing their ingredients from. So it really starts with how things are grown and, farming sustainably, some of the farming practices, whether you're using dry irrigation or not. You're doing dry farming or you're using irrigation. They also use landrace grains and heirloom varietals. They have used a few that were on the brink of extinction, and by kind of working with the local culinary community and farming community, they've helped bring certain type of varietals back from the brink of extinction. And actually in the image you can see right now, that's a Jimmy Red corn. It was down to the last few cobs, and then they were able to help bring it back. And now it is the source of their Jimmy Red bourbon, 100% corn bourbon, which is a little abnormal for whiskey. And they're kind of focusing a lot of their work on that. And you really get a sense of place with this whiskey. So that's what I would say that the whiskey chapter really focuses on. And then next is about agave. And so I went to Mexico to talk to Pedro Jimenez, who is pictured in the photo right there. He is the proprietor of Mizonte, and they're sort of like an aggregate where they work with a lot of different distillers who are making mezcal, mostly in the region of Jalisco, where it's normally known for tequila, but their focus is mezcal. And so I went down to talk to him about what he does, working with a lot of different producers, considering the historical and the cultural implications of making mezcal traditionally, and also what that means for the environment. So he's got criteria that's built into the initial conversations he has with producers about, can you can you grow this agave? Can you make this mezcal that is in scale with what the environment can handle? What are the ecological impacts? And, is it possible to tip it the other way where it's not great? So he's kind of looking at all these things, and also different considerations, because it is Mexico, it's not the United States. So what's at stake down there? And he's been able to create a really successful label. And actually, something I find very beautiful about this is that he keeps a lot of that mezcal in Mexico. So you kind of have to, there's a few places around the country that carry it, but he's really keeping it domestically for them. The next chapter focuses on gin and vodka, and I focus on the Leopold brothers, who are based in just outside of Denver, Colorado. They're a brother duo, hence their name. Todd Leopold is the distiller, and Scott Leopold is the environmental engineer who really created a lot of the systems of the distillery. I feel no hesitation in saying that they are probably the most advanced environmentally, globally. They're doing things really well. Every part of their operation is in service of the environment. And this story is really interesting because this was part of their original model, but when they were initially trying to find funding, a lot of banks wouldn't give them loans because there was this idea that if you were environmentally conscious, you could not be luxurious or you wouldn't be a successful business. So that's an interesting part of their story. And since they've opened, they've also created their own malt house. So they're growing and malting their own barley, which means that they can make their own neutral grain spirits, which is gin and vodka, and serves as the base for a lot of their liqueurs. So everything is done in-house. They also source a lot of their ingredients from local farms within maybe 50 miles from the distillery. They use wooden tanks, which means their cleaning is different. They have solar panels on the distillery. They use a lot of natural light. Colorado gets really hot. That's something I discovered when I went to go visit. And they use a lot of water and energy very, very efficiently. And their father is actually a landscape architect who used to work for the Bureau of Land Management, and they planted all this native flora around the distillery. They keep the windows open, so then a lot of the local bees come in, and so they're doing wild fermentation, and it's all really local. So again, sense of place, but also thinking from a systems approach really holistically about their operation. And then next is the rum chapter. And rum, if you're a rum fan, know that this can get really complicated. It's a very regional spirit where things are all different depending on where the country of origin that this is coming from, or even the place of origin within the country. But I focus in this chapter on two different distilleries. One was relatively new. They kind of started right before COVID hit. They're called Equiano, and they are an Afro-Caribbean rum. And then the other is Montagna, and I'll tell you a little bit. Ian Burrell, who's in the corner pouring the drink, he is somebody who is thinking about the history of rum and how things are sourced, and through the lens of colonization and the complicated history of things, but also looking at, how are we sourcing the sugarcane that we're using, and what are the implications both environmentally but also socially from the places that we're working on this with. And then also challenging the idea that additives need to go into rum. And then we have down in the other corner, Karen Hoskin, and sorry, this is a little bit of a blurry photo of both of them, but she's really thinking about things along the lines of a lot of other people with the sourcing. And one thing I think that makes them stand out is that they are a certified B Corp distillery. So that means that everything they do has to be quantified. They are measuring everything down to the amount of water they use, what the carbon footprint is of their operation, down to the kind of ink that they use to print their labels. And she actually does add a little bit of caramel coloring to make her rum, to enhance the color, and is very transparent about that. So it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition between the two distilleries. And when you go on Montagna's website, they are they're like radically transparent. There's something about every aspect of their distillery that you can find in detail on their website. And then next is about brandy. So it's a fruit-based liqueur. I look at this story from a California perspective, which is a state environmentally defined by fire and drought. We're always, it's a thing. I'm based in California, and this is something that is we live with every single day. I have to check the air quality before I open my windows for a lot of the year. Water is something that we're constantly trying to preserve. And then, so I looked at St. George spirits, and you can see the three generations of the distillers, including all the way on the left, Jorg Repf, who is the founder. And he started, St. George is the first craft distillery in the US that had opened since Prohibition. They started in 1982, and they started with brandy. And he was getting Jorg was originally getting these pears from California. He really loved the way they taste. He's from Germany, and the California pears really reminded him of home. But since the pressures on the land have changed, also with agriculture products, what's more valuable, a lot of local pear trees were ripped up and replaced with grapevines. So there's all these pressures about what's actually available. And then when fires break out, it's really challenging. And then I also wanted to kind of set up looking at the spectrum of things. You can't practice crop rotation with pear trees. So what does that mean? And what does it mean when you grow is the idea of growing something conventionally versus organic? What does that mean for different types of industry or different types of spirits, essentially? So this is kind of the climate change chapter. And then I moved to bartenders, and there's about 4 different bartenders that I follow in this chapter, but I wanted to highlight one in particular. His name is Ryan Chettiwardana, and he's based in London or the UK, and has this group called Mr. Lion, and they've won all sorts of awards, critically acclaimed. He's opened a few bars where he's really thinking about waste, and also about a lot of the trends that happen within bartending, whether that's foraging for ingredients and looking at what's scalable, what can you do, what's too much. It's really, this idea of foraging for ingredients is really cool, but what happens when everyone goes out to forage? You're gonna throw the ecosystem out of balance. So one of his menus at this hotel bar called Dandelion really focused on this idea. And also one thing that he brought up that I thought was really interesting was this idea of why luxury and sustainability. There's this idea that they can't go hand in hand. And this is something that he's trying to challenge with all of his programs, that they can actually coexist and they can create a wonderful experience to get people thinking about things. This also kind of goes back to the idea of the Leopold brothers who couldn't get bank loans because you weren't considered successfully. But here's this bartender in the UK who's creating companies that are winning global accolades for their work. And then next, I really wanted to think about, this is all well and great when you're doing this on a smaller scale, but what happens when you want to scale up? And this is the chapter where a lot of these people come back together and think through these ideas of scale. And I did go down to Kentucky for this chapter, and I talked to the Maker's Mark Distillery, they're owned by a big global corporation. They have a ton of money, but they've been doing things on this land since they were founded, essentially. And I was very skeptical about going down to visit and trying to see where things are, but they have a whole environmental team. And instead of focusing on how whiskey is made or different components of this, they're really thinking about land stewardships. All the water that they use comes from the watershed that the property is on. So how do we think about preserving the watershed for future generations, and thinking about we have to protect this water because it's what's going into the distilling, the fermentation, the bottling, every aspect of this. It's what they're using to clean things as well. And then they're also wood is a really big thing in Kentucky. And so they're also really involved in looking at long-term health of forests. And that part is a part of the story that I don't hear people talk about very often because it is pretty disconnected. But in Kentucky and at Maker's Mark, they are involved in something called the White Oak Initiative, looking at forest health. And we can talk more about that later. But so that was looking at one idea of scale and what the trade-offs are there. And that's kind of the run through of the book. And so yeah, I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Shanna, for giving us an overview of the book and really fascinating sort of top level. And now it's our opportunity to dig into some of the details, and just encourage folks to submit questions through the Q&A, and I'll sort of get us started. And one thing that I reflected on about your book, Shanna, it seems to me in some ways the book is really about people, places, and their work. And also how the intersection of those individual stories, and as an oral historian and storyteller, you really do an excellent job of sort of highlighting people, the places that they live, and the work that they're doing. So as you look across the different profiles, what seem to be the commonalities in the stories about what motivates these folks? Why do they put this passion into their work, and why is sustainability such an important priority for the different people that you profile?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think one of the common threads is they care about the planet. They care about the long-term health. I mean, I think that's kind of the basic and obvious one. But then it also goes to the flavor of things. I mean, I think that across the board, everyone would agree that the better ingredients, the more care that they're grown with, that the better it's going to taste. With the whiskey chapter, I kind of look at yellow dent corn, which is a commodity crop. And a lot of whiskey producers just kind of source this. They have no idea what state it's coming from. So there's this real disconnect, but the corn is used because it's resilient, it's consistent, it has high sugar contents to be able to make the alcohol, but it's pretty basic. I mean, it's not super interesting. That's why a lot of the attention gets paid to how the distillers are actually aging it, or how are they distilling it, instead of how it's grown. But the counter to that is Highwire, who's really thinking about the ingredients, making it special, and it just tastes so good. I mean, that's the big part of it. And I think that would be the answer for all of them too, is flavor and taste. And that also gets to the bottom line of you're going to sell something if it tastes good.
Right. So it sounds like they're being motivated by potentially environmental value orientation, by a concern for planetary management and ensuring sort of a thriving future, but they're also motivated by a differentiator, a way to have a unique product, and a unique high quality product that will stand out in the marketplace. It's an interesting observation, just the way that many of the advertisers and marketers of these products focus on certain elements of their production as opposed to the inputs, their ingredients, right? Because of this consistency and these kind of monoculture inputs into the process. That's an interesting observation. Let me ask you a similar question about you. What motivated you to explore this particular topic? Across your career, you've drawn from your background to look into environmental history and oral history. What drew you to an investigation of sustainability in the context of spirits?
Yeah, so I was a bartender for over a decade, about 15 years. And when I was in graduate school, my graduate work kind of focused on the impact of water pollution. I was looking at how the Hudson River, being a Superfund site, disproportionately affected communities. And I had done this work across a couple different grad programs, and then all the while I was bartending. And so I was doing an oral history project around this. And while I was bartending, there was this really beautiful bottle on the back bar. And I just kept picking. I mean, it was just so beautiful. I was drawn to it. And on the label, it said made with 100% New York State grain. And I had never seen an attribute like that before. Most, spirit, you're not required to have an ingredient list on spirits because of the way it's regulated. And this had that on there. And I ended up doing an oral history interview with the founder of that distillery. And he was talking about creating a direct relationship from the farms with the distillery. And I hadn't thought about these ideas before. So that's kind of what sparked it. And then I started to do a lot more research about, I mean, I am conscious, I try to be as conscious of an eater as possible. And so I'm looking at where things come from. And then there's a few cocktails that I really love to drink, I really love to make, but maybe one of the ingredients is a bright red color. And so that's not necessarily natural. And so I did do some research and found that there's a lot of additives that get put into these liqueurs or some spirits. And so fast forward to moving to California, I live in San Francisco, and I'm at restaurants where it's very common to write the purveyor of this meat that we're eating, or where the lettuces are grown. And knowing that there's additives in certain things, I would flip over the menu and look at the cocktail menu and ask for an alternative to a certain liqueur. And the server would look at me or the bartender, like I had 6 heads. Like, just why would you even ask for an alternative? This is the commonly accepted thing. And so I, at that point, realized that there is a huge disconnect between the way food is being treated at restaurants versus how alcohol is being treated. It's a complete afterthought, even though the bar is really the profit center of restaurants. So it's kind of the long answer there, but that's how I started to dig into it.
Yeah, that's great. The story about your experiences there in San Francisco reminds me of that classic Portlandia episode where the actors go out to meet the farmer and meet the chickens that are the source. I'm going to ask one more of my questions, and then we have some great questions coming in from the audience. And you've already started to touch on this, but how is this movement of sustainability within this industry and the spirits and the focus on sustainability and the types of agricultural products that are used in the creation of these spirits, how does that affect the sort of larger food system? Are there downstream effects in the supply chain and the value chain, whereby the decisions of these individuals, these distillers and the restaurants and bars, can that have positive impacts on the rest of the food system and the supply chain?
I think so. I think, this is a manufactured process. And so I think that every component in this is really important, whether you're thinking about the farming practices and the land, or you're thinking about transportation and how things move across the supply chain. Thinking about, are you going to ship something by truck? Is it going by train? Is it being shipped across the world? And what's the impact of that? I'd kind of mentioned that I was doing water research before. Water is a particularly important topic to me, especially, living in California with the droughts. A lot of distilleries don't even know how much water they're using that's going into producing these things. It's really hard for them to quantify, especially when they're using municipal water. They just turn on the tap and use it, and they pay for it. So I think consciousness level being raised about that will have a bigger impact, all the way to bartending and sort of the bottling and the plastic waste or the glass waste that goes into things. The more we start to engage, I think the more positive it's going to have on the whole entire downstream effect. Yeah.
Great. So let's go to some of the questions we have coming in from the audience. One of the questions is really about the social dimension of sustainability. And so people are interested not only in the environmental, but also the social aspects of sustainability and governance. So are any of the folks that you worked with, that you profiled, the distillers or the bar operators, the restaurant operators, are they working on social elements of their businesses? In particular, obviously alcohol has associated social challenges with it. So are any focused on the social implications of their product and the social sustainability of their workforce and elements of sustainability in that realm?
Yes, they absolutely are. I think, it's interesting. The alcohol industry is a huge moneymaker. It's huge. It employs a lot of people. And I do think since Prohibition, it still gets a bad rap, and that can get in the way of people doing really good things and trying to make strides in an industry that's really not going to go anywhere. But alternatively to that too, there are people, aside from that, there are corporations or these distilleries that are really thinking about these things. One great example of this is Montana with the B Corp certification. One of the elements of that is making sure that there's equitable employment and the social aspect. So there's DIE things that are happening within those business models. What is the impact of how these farming, you're sourcing from the sugarcane plantation, but how are those workers being treated? Are they getting paid in an equitable way? The rum chapter really goes into detail about that, especially with the colonial history there. It's also something that comes up in the whiskey chapter, and really acknowledging the role that enslaved people had in creating this whiskey. That's something that people are really thinking about. And then also, I think, there's all these. I find that these people, if they're thinking about the environment, they're also thinking about the social aspect too.
That's interesting. I'm going to follow up on this on Montagna in particular. You mentioned this B Corp approach. So what is the role in your investigation of certification programs, licensure programs, this sort of systematic evaluations of these enterprises, and how do the enterprises, the owners, relate to those types of certifications and licensure types programs, which can be, on one hand, provide a sort of systematic approach and can ensure, as you suggested, reporting and transparency, et cetera. But on the other hand, some people may think that they're overly limiting or constraining, especially to this type of operator who is trying to work outside of a sort of conventional approach. So what's the sort of sense across the spectrum of folks that you spoke with about these programs?
Yeah, and also those certification programs can be cost prohibitive as well. So there's that, especially if you're a small distillery, you can't really afford that. So the B Corp thing is it's new. I mean, there's not a lot of certification programs that exist. I think that the B Corp certification is kind of the only one. Distilleries can opt to work with farms that are certified organic, but then also thinking about, the farms that can afford that certification. I think so. There's not a lot of people that know even what a B Corp is, and there's kind of that learning curve there. But it is real, and to get that certification, because you have to quantify everything, not just environmentally, but also socially. It's really hard to do. So that means you have to employ people to do that, and you have to be implementing all of those systems. So it can be really hard, but I will say, going through, it is useful to go through that process and look at what, we could quantify this. We don't necessarily have to pay for this certification, but we can follow some of their models. I think that that's one way that people are starting to think about things. And I think that people laud the idea of being a B Corp, but can't necessarily do it. So it's sort of like, what's the middle path there?
Right.
I think that there are maybe a couple of other certifications that are coming online now, but they're really small scale, and there's only a handful of people doing them. And to be quite honest, I can't even remember the names off the top of my head. So I think that there's only room to grow in that direction.
Right. Well, and so that gets also to the question if forming a B Corp or trying to look for other types of sustainability certifications may be challenging or beyond the scope of some enterprises. Are there burgeoning communities of practice or associations of particularly potentially small or independent businesses who are trying to engage in more peer-to-peer learning and sharing their practices across the businesses?
It's really slow to happen in the spirits industry. It's not, I think that everyone who's doing these things are very siloed. It's kind of, we're doing this because we care about it. It's important to us, but there's not necessarily like a coalition or even like a working group to talk about these things. There is the American, it's the Craft Spirits Association of America, and they do have different seminars about this kind of thing, but it's it's a little bit slow to catch on. I think there still is this idea that if you are thinking about sustainability, you can't be successful. So, I mean, even Maker's Mark, they're huge, and they really can afford to tell this story, for some reason haven't. So I think the more people are talking about it, the more maybe this is one of the hopes for the book, is that people are less siloed and can come together to talk about this stuff.
Sure. Yeah. And I definitely hope that inspires more conversation. And of course, consumer demand would have a pretty important influence there on the prioritization of these of sustainability aspects within the industry. So in the book, you detailed not only the agriculturalists, the farmers, and the distillers, but you also talk about bars and restaurants and sustainability within that part of the value chain. So what did you learn about what is important for sustainability within, say, the operations of a bar and restaurant? What types of practices were profiled in the book?
Yeah, that one is really interesting because I feel like there's actually way more discussion within the bar industry and bartending about sustainability than there is from the production side. There are many things, and I think a lot of them sort of depend on what municipal services are offered. I live in California and we have composting. And I was actually bartending part-time until a few months ago, and composting is a part of our practice. It's something we think about all the time because we are in drought. We don't run water unless we have to. We have to ask a guest, do you want water? Or they have to ask for it. It's just not automatically served. But in other parts of the country, there's this practice called burning ice, which essentially, if you have like in a well, a ton of ice that you're making drinks with, at the end of the night, if you haven't used all of that ice, there's a practice where you run hot water to melt the ice so you can clean. So you're essentially using water to melt water, and that's incredibly wasteful. There's also places that don't recycle, so even down to that aspect. So it's, there a few years ago were some campaigns about why you shouldn't burn ice at the end of the night, or why you should think about recycling more, or even down to looking at all the packaging that bottles come in. The plastic, if something is just like covered in plastic and you have to rip that off, it goes in the trash. You can't recycle that. So having bar operators or people in a position of power where they do the ordering to say, hey, I'm not going to accept this order if it comes wrapped in all this plastic, or if, there lots of companies make trinkets where they're using rubber, or that's like a rubber keychain that's then wrapped in plastic and then also has metal and leather on it. And so saying, I'm not accepting this order if you're going to provide me with these trinkets. We don't use them. They go in the trash. It's really wasteful. So I think, thinking about that, there was this movement to reuse ingredients, using like a lime shell to make a cordial or something. So you're giving things second life. But a couple of the people that I profiled in the book who are thinking about these things kind of later came to the conclusion that that's maybe not the best way to go, because you have to keep adding new stuff to it. So it's never just really a second use. It's kind of just continuing the same wasteful cycle. And so they had started to look at, maybe I should think about where the spirits I'm choosing to carry, where those come from and how they're made. So it kind of all goes back to the sourcing thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that picks up on a question that was asked from one of our audience members, and really about this idea of circularity and a circular economy model. And there have been movements in some parts of the industry, including in the beer brewing industry, to look at circularity in products, for example, using leftover beer making ingredients for baking bread. And are there similar kind of movements within distilleries and the kind of spirits you were looking at, where they're trying to think about circularity in their processing and production?
Yes, definitely. So one of I think the easiest and most common practices is so when you distill alcohol, you're essentially, there's like, if you look at the whole batch, there's called the heads and the tails and then the heart. And usually distillers are just using the heart. It's the middle thing. But instead of throwing out the tails, all the sort of impure alcohol that's not going to make it to the bottle, saving that and using it to clean all of the equipment at the end. So you're not buying things, you're just cleaning things that you've using alcohol that you've produced naturally. I mean, I think that it makes sense given that during the pandemic, a lot of distilleries pivoted to making hand sanitizer because they had that option. And then there are some distilleries who all the spent grain after it's distilled, bringing it to local farms to use as feed. There are distillers who do that. Yeah, I think that those are probably the two most common. And then there are some distilleries who have chosen to use wooden fermentation tanks instead of steel because you can't use chemicals to clean them, synthetic chemicals to clean them. It gets into the wood and then it becomes part of the spirit if you're using synthetic chemicals on wood. So I think that they are thinking about that. It's a pretty low barrier to entry with that. So it's a pretty easy way to do it. The other thing I did want to say, the relationship between the beer industry and the spirits industry is kind of looks the gin and vodka chapter with the Leopold brothers, because they have their own malting house. The way that they're never going to put more stills in their, or I'm sorry, more fermentation tanks in their distillery. They're kind of at their max capacity, but they did build a brand new malting house, and they've been selling a lot of the malt that they're making locally to Colorado-based breweries. So it's kind of a give and take there too. Yeah.
So then I'd like to pick up on the scale chapter and the discussion that you had about scaling. And so just what did you learn from these profiles about how well practices that foreground sustainability concerns can effectively scale, and how much of these practices can be adopted or translated into existing large-scale operations? So if you take some of these more boutique scale operations, can they grow their businesses and have greater market share and greater influence? And or then could they force some of the larger, multinational corporations to adopt some practices to be able to compete or just explain a little bit more about what you learned about scaling, because that's such an important discussion when you're talking about sustainability.
It's like the $1 million question. The scaling part is really interesting, and it's funny. There's a former bar owner here who thinks about spirits as agricultural products. And in the early days of working on this book, I would just come back from Charleston, South Carolina, and it's this very down to three cobs that they've saved. And he started laughing, and I was like, "Why are you laughing?" He's like, "Well, how do you scale that?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's a really good point." And so, using Highwire as an example, they did move to a new distillery where they were able to put more equipment in, but then they're not just using 3 farms anymore. They've actually started using more farms to grow things. So that's one way of thinking about scale. And then they've also implemented their new distillery. They have an event space. So they're also able to earn supplemental income through doing renting out spaces and then having dinner with local chefs who are thinking about things in the same way to promote these ideas. That's one way, but that's all still independent. And then, a company like Mizonte, where they're essentially an aggregate, I guess what they'd have to do is just bring on more distillers. But that's also just such a small team. Trying to manage all those people is really difficult. But then you think about a place like the financial aspect with Montagna is really interesting. They have decided not to, they're essentially a publicly traded company. So you can buy into it, but the Karen kind of retains controlling shares. So they have this money coming in that affords them to be able to become a B Corp and hire these people and communications people to talk about transparency. But for people, and then there's also like Maker's Mark, who did get bought by a huge corporation several years back, and they use some of that money to create a LEED certified building, and all of their new properties are supposed to be LEED certified, and they could hire a team of land stewards who are trying to care for the watershed and but it's a spectrum, it's a trade-off. I don't think that there's ever going to be a ton of Jimmy Red Corn bourbon that'll be for sale forever. It's a thing where you can only, knowing what your limits are, it's also going to be priced more expensively because it is more exclusive, it's limited. Whereas, Maker's Mark, you can find it across the globe. And one of their trade-offs too is interesting. This didn't make it to the book, but I did go to the family farm where they get all of their grain from. And the farmers who, no one had ever visited them and said like, we want to know where this stuff comes from. They said to me like, hey, if Maker's Mark wanted organic grain for their whiskey, we grow it. Like if you look in that direction, somebody else asked for it and we're growing it over there, but Maker's Mark had never asked for it. So it's an interesting, like, they do it in some ways, but not in the other ways.
Yeah, and so it raises a connection in my mind, both in terms of the scaling as well as the certification program. Are the folks that you've profiled looking to other industries for their approaches and learning? So it comes to mind that today is actually National Coffee Day in the United States, right? And so at ASU, we have a long-term and deep partnership with Starbucks, and Starbucks is one of the leaders in the cafe practices, the coffee and farmer equity practices approach, which was one of the early industry programs to look at ethical sourcing and to deal with some of these sustainability perspectives. So, and I believe that was developed in collaboration with Conservation International. So are there any rumblings that you've heard about adopting some of these other practices that may have been applied in a context like coffee or chocolate, or for example, as other industries?
Yeah, I think Montagna is one, looking at with the B Corp certification, it's kind of required to do that. But I do think that going back to the Leopold brothers, so, Todd, the distiller, gets a lot of love because he's a distiller and he's kind of the magician and making the art sing. But Scott really enables that, his brother, who's the environmental engineer. And the book really profiles Scott because I think he's driving so much of this. And before he was a partner in this distillery, he was a consultant who was helping companies across different industries who were in violation of the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, or, they were producing way too much waste. So his job was to go in and try to fix their systems and create systems that were in accordance with the laws. So he was helping them kind of become legit. And so he was looking at how does this work from all these other industries, and then took what he knew and put it into the distilling industry. And that's why I think that they're so advanced, because it does borrow from so many other industries, and thinking about every single component being in service of this larger goal.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So another question that really focuses on the consumer side of this equation, and that is the question is, what should we as cocktail or beer or wine enthusiasts be most aware about in terms of our purchasing? In terms of, you said, part of this initiative was motivated by your own interest in looking at a particularly beautiful bottle, and then that provoked you to think about, how are these products made and sourced, et cetera. So, what should we use as considerations or factors when we're looking at spirits to purchase?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a very important one. A few takes on this. So first, what not to do. I would say, don't go to your local bar and ask your bartender, where did this grain come from in this whiskey? They're not going to know. It's probably going to be embarrassing. It's going to be hard. I mean, it's not a conversation that bartenders are really having. And because there's no ingredients label, that's also part of the problem. But I will say one thing where you can go ask those questions are to liquor stores, especially places, you can go to your local liquor store and kind of, do a Google search or do a search. Do you carry Leopold Brothers? And then they probably can answer some of these questions. The retailing side, it's part of their job to be able to answer these questions. And they also have the purchasing power where if you're going into a liquor store and you're asking these questions, they're going to go to the distributor or the companies that they're buying from and saying, look, we're getting a ton of these questions. We need to know how to answer these questions. Can you give us this information? So it's kind of by asking those questions at a liquor store, you're forcing the retailers to engage that way. And they have so much purchasing power that it will, I think, force some distilleries to be more transparent about what they're doing. Or, like Maker's Mark, who never told this story, realize how important it is to put this front and center. The other thing I think that's important is voting and, thinking about, again, like I live in a city where there is composting, but in a lot of other cities, there's not. So how do we get these systems in place, which does make the downstream impact less? And so I would say, engaging civically in that way is important.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that brings up a couple issues in terms of the downstream effects, especially in the physical product, and recycling as you know is kind of in chaos right now in the United States at municipal and sort of national, even the global
Yeah.
scale. Are the producers conscientious about this? How are they sort of thinking about their responsibility for the downstream waste effects of their products, in particular the glass and aluminum and other glass and aluminum and how that affects the system?
I think that is something that a lot of people are thinking about and engaged in, and would be very quick to say, yeah, I want recycled glass.
Mm-hmm.
However, or, it's also cheaper for them too, to be able to sell a bottle and then have a consumer come to the distillery and refill it. That would be amazing. However, because of the way that our laws work in the United States, that's prohibited. You can only, essentially all alcohol bottles are single use. And that's part of the problem. And I think that gets to civic engagement as well. And this all goes back to prohibition and something called the 3-tier system. So before prohibition, alcohol was regulated by the federal government. And then when the Volstead Act was repealed in 1933, one of the provisions was that it had to be regulated state by state. And so there are some laws locally where you can, and essentially what the 3-tier system says is that distilleries need to go through the retail aspect. They can't sell directly to consumers. So that is also part of the reason why a consumer, like a customer like me, can't go to my local distillery and just refill a bottle, because you're bypassing you're messing with the 3-tier system. I think actually, since COVID, those things are changing and loosening a little bit. And especially I think that with COVID, looking at how the environmental impact of some of this stuff is happening, good and bad. There's more consciousness of this and all the climate change conversations. So that's why I also think that the voting part is important. I don't know if that answered the question, but
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It brings up the fact that you've mentioned a couple times the way that either regulation or policies that were enacted, in the post-prohibition era have sort of set the stage or framed the conversation here. In particular, you've mentioned several times that there's not an ingredients list on these things. You've mentioned the way that the industry is regulated in the 3-tier system. Are there the COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted a lot of things, and so there's a lot of sort of rethinking going on in different areas. Is there any sort of active lobbying or pressure that could result in changes, for instance, to the labeling and the ingredients? Because that seems like a pressure point where the producers would feel response from consumers if consumers had more information about the products and potentially, the ingredients in those products.
Yeah, so that part is really interesting, the regulation part, because this also, I think, gets at the disconnect between food and spirits. They're not regulated by the same agencies. The FDA regulates food, and the TTB, which is it's a trade bureau, they regulate alcohol along with firearms and tobacco. So they don't say you have to have a label, but it really goes back to the taxation part of things. It's optional. Distilleries can put an ingredients list on their labels, and that is actually something that I think consumers can ask distilleries, like, why don't you have an ingredients list on here? They're not required to, but I think it is a pressure point that people can add to it. In terms of lobbying to change that system, it's hard and expensive. I mean, it's essentially like changing an agency regulation. So that goes up the government chain, and it's very difficult to do. I think that even with a 3-tier system, I want to say like 7 or 8 years ago in California, there were a few people who were really leading the charge and trying to work with lobbyists to get different measures on the bill, on the voting, on the like on the ballot, that's the word I'm looking for. So different measures on the ballot about changing operations and being able to sell directly to a consumer. But it really just depends who's in power and what they're receptive to. And I think that changing the agency is going to be really difficult, especially because I think that goes back to like the whiskey rebellion in the 1700s. So yeah.
That's great. It sounds like a good, could be a good section of your environmental history class on,
Yeah.
what does the Whiskey Rebellion have to do with the beer you drank last night, right?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
That would be a fun class to teach.
Great lecture. And so I think that we're sort of coming to the end of the session, and I'm seeing we're sort of running low on questions here. We've done such a great job of covering so much ground, and so I just want to give you an opportunity to kind of offer any sort of closing or summarizing thoughts, and about the book, and I think Lauren's going to share some information with everyone about where we can purchase the book. We especially locally, we really like to promote our partners at Changing Hands Bookstore, our local independent bookstore. And so if folks are interested, we really want to encourage them to reach out to Changing Hands to get a copy of this book and share it with their friends. And but are there sort of final thoughts that you want to leave folks with about this and about the rest of your work and anything else that you might be coming out with next?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say all about the plugs for the local bookstores. But you're all here, so you're clearly interested in this topic. But I think it's have these conversations, ask these questions. I definitely want to feel like people should feel empowered to ask these questions, to go to their local liquor store and engage in these things, talk to people, think about, why haven't I thought about this before, and maybe what my alternatives are. So I hope that it inspires some of that. I'm going to be writing more about the B Corp thing coming up, and looking at the role of water. So that's kind of what's next, is specifically focusing on water. So
well, it's a critically important topic for you in California, for us in Arizona as well.
Yeah.
Something that we share in terms of sharing a watershed from the Colorado River. So I encourage you to follow that line of work. It's desperately needed to pay attention to. So in closing, I'll just say thank you, Shanna, for your sharing your time with us and for sharing the stories. And I look forward to future conversations, and hopefully in the next time we meet, we can meet together, and we can meet in person, and we can meet in sharing a sustainably produced spirit.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate the time and the great questions.
And thanks to everyone who joined us, and thanks to Lauren and Brandon and the events team for organizing everything.
Thank you, one and all.